Whoa! Cabrini Green is a real place. They drenched that bathroom set in fake blood.
Hi, my name is Tasha Wheelhouse, and I'm going to talk to you about Candyman from 1992. This is a horror film that has captured people's imaginations for the last 30 years, and I'd love to talk to you about why.
Let's talk about Clive Barker a little. The dude is really, I don't even know how to describe Clive Barker. The guy has like his own plane of existence. Describes himself as a professional imaginer, as he does art, he does sketches, he does painting, he does filmmaking, he writes books. And what's even more awesome and kind of gives me hope as an adult is he didn't even begin his writing career until he was 31. Now, Books of Blood was published and was out there for a minute, but it didn't really have a lot of popularity until after it was given a positive review by Stephen King. Stephen King is very well known for taking independent horror writers' fictions, reading them, reviewing them. I think that's how, he keeps his creativity and keeps his saw sharp on his own writing. Clive was like, oh man, those books just exploded. And it paved the path for a lot of different avenues for his art to express itself, particularly in Hollywood. Well, what can we adapt of Clive Barker's into film? And a project that everybody really knows, and Clive Barker himself directed, was Hellraiser in 1987. And after that, studios still wanted to produce more of Clive's stuff. So Bernard Rose, the future director for Candyman, was approached by the studio and said, hey, we'd like you to do a film based on one of Clive's short stories. It's called In the Flesh, and we really think it could be a good hit. Will you please go give it a read and tell us what you think? Bernard Rose did pick up a Books of Blood series, and he did begin to read In the Flesh, which this short story is about the following. Cleve is a man who is in prison, and he is given a new cellmate. This cellmate is nuts because he purposefully put himself in jail because this is the prison where that guy's great-grandfather was, and he's trying to summon his great-granddad's spirit. Bernard wasn't too keen on this one, so to quote him, he said, I thought it was really well written, but impossible to make because it's about two prisoners in complete darkness in a cell. And of course, one thing you can't represent in a movie is darkness, because if you're in a movie theater, then there's nothing to see. It would, however, make a great radio play, but it wasn't really a great idea for a movie. However, when Bernard was reading this Books of Blood, he flipped over to a couple of other stories in this book series. It was a story called The Forbidden, and that is the original story for where Candyman comes from. Candyman was this entity who just existed out of pure belief of the people around him. Around this time, it was actually pretty popular to talk about urban legends, but not many things in television or media had been done to represent them, which he thought was very strange. So Bernard Rose, the future director for Candyman, reached out to Clive Barker. Bernard was actually a little bit anxious to talk to Clive about it because he didn't want to center it in where the book was centered, which is Liverpool, England. But the thing is, Clive was actually kind of like, nah, cool, go make what you like. I think that sounds like a great idea. I think you're gonna have a lot of fun with it, which is incredible. Most authors are like, my baby, no touchy. So with that, Bernard decided that he was going to check out Chicago, Illinois. He felt like the dichotomy of a classism system, which was existent in the book, the short story, The Forbidden, kind of a downtrodden neighborhood that existed in Chicago just as easy that he could shoot at. He went with the Illinois Film Commission and a bevy of police officers, and they toured around Illinois to downtrodden neighborhoods to scout out for shooting. One of the locations they visited was Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green is a real place, or at least it was until it was torn down. Bernard Rose was so enamored with this location that even after he had taken his tour with the Illinois Film Commission, he went back to Cabrini Green on his own, no police escorts or anything like that, to go tour the place with a new perspective. He actually made friends with a woman who lived there. This is actually where the character of Anne-Marie comes from. And here's the cool part. The more Bernard Rose dug in about Cabrini Green as a place, the more entranced he became with its story and its rich history. Murderous history, to be exact. There was a string of serial killer murders that were happening at Cabrini Green, the kind where the guy literally was popping out the medicine cabinet of adjoining apartment complexes to break in to kill people. Was literally a 911 phone call of someone saying, help me, someone's breaking into my apartment from my bathroom, from my medicine cabinet. And they didn't believe her and they ignored the call. The murder of Ruthie Jean is a real thing that happened at Cabrini Green. The news articles that Helen researches when she's investigating the history of Candyman, and it pulls up those excerpts of Who Killed Ruthie Jean, those are real news articles from the Chicago Reader. Whoa! That was not even a prop. That was an actual news article that he used in the film. Here's another really neat piece about Cabrini Green. Not just the architectural flaw of the medicine cabinet that existed in the layout of the apartment buildings at Cabrini Green, there is a mirrored building a few blocks away, like where Helen lives in the story of the movie, that has a similar architectural build and the same problem where you could pop out the medicine cabinet and sneak into the apartment next to you. And thus began this idealism around mirroring between the two places and the mirror of Candyman and how all of that started to build on top of each other. But the most important thing came out of this. In the short story The Forbidden, Candyman wasn't black. Because of the rich story and telling that comes from Cabrini Green itself, that is the biggest change that happened. Candyman was now going to be African American, and it would show this dichotomy of not just classism, but also race. I wanted to make a film grounded in reality, but the whole racial subtext of the film came out of that. It wasn't part of the original story. That was about politics and class differences. The racial element was added to it by the specificity of the location. It wasn't until after casting that Bernard had a real production problem. How do you wrangle bees on a movie set? Well, it was actually kind of an interesting answer of what happened. There was a performer who was known for actually having bees crawl all over him while playing the clarinet on the Johnny Carson show. His name was Norman Gary, and he kind of became like the bee guy of Hollywood. It's kind of wild how he's just like, yeah, I can make bees crawl all over you. We better do baby bees though, because they don't have as developed stingers or claws. That actually didn't stop anybody from getting stung. They did try their best efforts. Virginia Madsen, the woman who plays the main character, she described how they would have this big net around the set, which didn't inspire confidence in her as an actor because, you know, it was to protect the crew, but she was on the inside of the net. And she was also deathly allergic to bees. Whenever they had these shots, they would have an ambulance nearby on the ready. Poor Tony Todd, he got stung a lot, like a lot. He was like kind of okay with it because he said his lawyer had worked it into his contract that every time he got stung, he'd get $1,000. He got stung 27 times during the course of this shooting. Oh, and Bernard Rose, he was having such a hard time even keeping his crew on bee shoot days. There would just be straight up crew that would not show up to work, just done. So Bernard Rose approaches Gary Norman. How do you just avoid getting stung? Gary Norman looks at him and says, you don't. You just decide it doesn't bother you anymore. After shooting, there is of course the rough cut and putting pieces together and then having it be screened with audiences to kind of get like good feedback on what's going to happen next. 1991, that is the year that we have Rodney King beaten in the street with multiple police officers around him, but unbeknownst to those officers, they were being recorded by a film camcorder. And yes, cameras used to be like hoisted on your shoulders like this, which is why I'm motioning like that because I'm old enough to remember those. And that actually triggered a riot in LA that swept like wildfire. The producers got scared. Well, we're done. We're not showing it to anybody else. People were finding out that Candyman was going to be portrayed by a black actor. That set off a lot of alarms for some people around Hollywood because they're like, you can't portray a black actor opposite of a white blonde woman. The optics are not great. But I gotta say, from everything that I have researched, Tony Todd put in a lot of forethought and effort into the character of Candyman as being this elevated black person post-Civil War who then was lynched, and that he, as a character, is bigger than life than everybody else on the screen, which is what Bernard Rose's opinion is. Candyman is only on screen for 10 minutes, but arguably he is the biggest takeaway of that film that every audience member remembers when they leave. And they really did try their best to work with the NAACP, but even then, Tony Todd did say that the NAACP said that they would ban him for life if he portrayed this part. And to his credit, he did. He went on to be Candyman. The studios were trying their best to alleviate any kind of racial tension fears in the media because their argument was, why can't Hannibal Lecter be black? Why can't Freddy Krueger be black? And in talking about the kind of fear that Candyman engenders, this is what Bernard Rose had to say. Equality and oppression creates fear among the oppressors because they are afraid of one day being called to account. This film is that in some ways, and that's why it's still powerful. But I did not have any sort of agenda except to try to represent what I'd seen in Chicago as realistically as possible. But Tony Todd has a very keen understanding that this character of Candyman does bring a lot of potential bridges of conversations for those who are actually in gangs, in housing projects, as this film resonates with them in a strange level where they actually feel the anger and the contempt that they believe they resonate with Candyman about. Tony Todd has actually worked with gang intervention groups to highlight discussion and talk about Candyman as a character, his development, his motivations, to help redirect the conversation about how to process those emotions. I love you guys. You give me unconditional love. For some reason, you love this film, and I'm still trying to figure out why. But the deepest people who love this film are people that live in projects, house projects all over the country. God bless Cabrini Green, which is no longer here. Over the years, I've worked with gang interventionists because for gangs, this is their favorite film. I honestly think that is really, really neat how much he takes to heart the implications of not just being this monster who happens to be black, but that there was a lot of elevated story that came from Candyman's background. The music. I remember listening going, the music in this film is gorgeous. Who made the decision for that? This is so far beyond what anyone expected in a horror film. For Philip Glass, he was known for doing like operas and stuff. He was a very elevated kind of composer, and Candyman was like his third or fourth score for a film. So let's talk about the reviews, the ratings, and the reception. Xander Berkeley, who plays the unfaithful husband in the film, did make an interesting comment about what kind of budget was provided for this film. I'm going to remind you, Get Out, which by inflation standards alone from 1991, today was only given a budget of $4.5 million. So $8 million 30 years ago was a lot more money. Why would a studio put up that much capital for an independent, untried intellectual property? The fact is, culturally, it wasn't until 2008 that the bottom of independent films fell out from funding. After Paranormal Activity, which you made for $15,000, why would I pay $8 million for someone to go make another horror film? There was a lot of shoestrapping around the idea of if you're going to make a horror film, it does not cost you that much. But in the 1990s, they were way more open to being experimental and fully funding it. And Xander Berkeley did kind of comment like he was so happy to grow up in that era of Hollywood of just experimenting with independent films that he got to participate in those things because it doesn't really happen as much anymore. So the film premieres at the Toronto Film Festival in 1992, and it was a pretty decent success. Budget of $8 million, but made well over $30 million at the box office. The studio was thrilled. They're like, whoa, did this thing just make back triple its money? We need to make a sequel right now. And Bernard Rose was like, guys, no, I'm not feeling it right now. I feel like it's a little bit soon to make that kind of call. And the studios were not happy with that answer. So they picked his brain for as many ideas as they could and then kicked him out the door and said, our writers will do it. Which is why when you watch the sequels to the Candyman films, I have not personally seen them yet, but I have heard they're not awesome. I mean, Tony Todd tried his absolute best. He is the Candyman through and through. Okay, let's talk about some of these main actors in this film. First, we're going to talk about Virginia Madsen. Here's an interesting factoid. The character of Helen was originally going to be played by Alexandra Pigg, who was the then wife of Bernard Rose. And Virginia Madsen was cast as Bernadette, the best friend that goes with the main character to Cabrini Green. Virginia Madsen got her start in the 1980s. She was on a few different television episodes of stuff, but she got a pretty decent break in 1984's Dune when she played Princess Irulan. Irulan. You guys are gonna have to tell me in the comments how to say that. I mean, I tried to scrub through the rest of her career on IMDb. There weren't a lot of standout projects that I have personally seen, but if there is something that you do recognize her from, please mention it, because most of the stuff that I do recognize her from are all from the 2000s on. When Virginia was asked about her experience while shooting Candyman, there was like a whole 2 weeks of just buckets and buckets and buckets and a literal fire hose of blood. And another fun little thing is that she's a little bit superstitious about saying Candyman 5 times into the mirror. To this day, she feels like she hasn't really done that all in one go. That even in the film, she says Candyman, 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 and then she breaks eye contact with the mirror and looks to Casey, and then looks at the mirror and says Candyman, which to her feels like she broke contact and she gave it enough breath of time that it counted as one. Bernard Rose does kind of touch on something that has to do with her character and a more universal fan theory. It's an entirely subjective movie told from the perspective of Helen, so whatever happens in this film, it's what she thought happened and isn't necessarily objective. There is definitely an interpretation of the film where she committed these murders. And even more fun things to talk about Candyman and Helen's character, Virginia Madsen does recall a very specific scene that was cut from Candyman that both her and Tony Todd were kind of sad about. Evidently, there was a scene where Candyman and Helen had a waltz together. I think we both felt like that was the most beautiful thing we did, because the thing about Candyman is he is a poet and a painter and an artist. He's so romantic. But because of the chemistry, the more it became apparent, the less they wanted of it. And yeah, it makes me mad. Talking again about Tony Todd and his career history. Tony Todd is no stranger to horror. In fact, it's pretty much his bread and butter. And while he does pride himself on being theater trained as well, he does have a lot of really good recognizable horror flicks to his name. Particularly right before Candyman, he was in the remake of Night of the Living Dead in 1990. So if there's something that you recognize Tony Todd in, comment it below, because I'd love to look into those things. Now, there was a rumor that Eddie Murphy was going to be the alternate option cast for Candyman, and Bernard Rose says it's like flat out not true. He completely denies it, even though it's been circling Hollywood for decades. When Tony Todd went into the audition, he pretty much just came in and was fabulous, and that was that. He had it in every sense of the word, and it was pretty obvious. There wasn't even a discussion about it. Tony Todd, when he was commenting about the bees, he had to use a dental dam in his mouth, covered the back of his mouth when they put the bees in there, so he couldn't feel the bees. They're just in this like sack in his mouth for him to open up his mouth for them to come out. Blech. When Tony Todd was asked about what was it that enticed him about this script, this is what he had to say. Being one of the first African American in a horror film that does not enslave us, that when I first read it, I looked for those traps. I wanted to make sure that if you're going to be one of the first significant Black actors in a horror film, you better make sure that it's complete, that it tells a story from beginning to middle to end. And that's what I saw in the script. And speaking of his gang outreach things, there was an interesting fact about the actual extras in cast of Candyman. There's a couple of scenes where you see actual gang members, and for them, it was the most honest living they had done up until that point. They got away from whatever their day-to-day routine was, and they were doing that while making the film. Xander Berkeley. Xander Berkeley is an interesting guy in the sense that he does a lot of bit parts, but that's kind of by design for his career. He once admitted TVs need a new bad guy every week, so that's easy work for him to grab, and he was cool with it. He had a lot of interesting back and forth, teeny tiny independents like Candyman, and then big blockbuster hits like Terminator 2 Judgment Day. So here's something that's kind of gotten my goat. I actually really hate the last couple minutes of Candyman. I don't think it works. What happens is that Xander Berkeley is in his bathroom and he's crying and he's lamenting the loss of Helen, even though he treated her like trash when she was alive. And he starts in mourning saying her name repeatedly while looking in the mirror, which would make sense if he said it 5 times. In the edit, he doesn't. And I made triple sure before I made this video because I'm he does not say it 5 times. He says it 4. And that drives me nuts because it's not even close. It's not an even 3. It's not the rule of 5. So here's the funny thing about that ending. That didn't even exist in the script or after the first wave of shooting. So what ended up happening in order for Xander Berkeley to just be completely eviscerated was during the initial first screenings before Rodney King happened, the audiences consistently came back with, that character needs to go. Bernard Rose came back to set and he literally had a fireman's hose and an air pump for blood. He said, okay, we're covering the bathroom in blood and you're gonna get ripped from nose to navel. And they did. They drenched that bathroom set in fake blood. I mean, almost to a comical point. If you rewatch the film and just look at the last couple of seconds of Xander Berkeley in the tub, you just kind of laugh of thinking, oh my gosh. That's more than just someone who got cut. That's just someone finger painting with blood all over the walls. And the original ending, I also think is also kind of bad, which was they were going to do this pan up to a wall at Cabrini Green, and there's going to be this gash in the wall. And the camera would go into the gash, and the gash would widen, and you'd go behind it, and you'd see the charred body of Helen, and then pop up to life, and that was going to be the end. But even then, that's where's the story? The rest of this thing has amazing story. Why are we doing that? I didn't love it. But that's also why we got the weird ending that we did. So take it for what it's worth. Okay, talking about the director, Bernard Rose. Bernard Rose had kind of an interesting history in Hollywood. He mostly worked with Jim Henson on The Muppet Show and The Dark Crystal. He's also notably the director for Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Relax, Go to It, When you wanna go, that's not the lyrics. Yes, that song. He is the director for that music video, which was banned by MTV for its BDSM themes. Then he went and did a film called Paper House, which is about a young girl who draws this image of a home, and when she puts herself into a trance or falls asleep, she can go visit this location of this fantastical world that she has drawn with the little boy in the window. He got a lot of decent acclaim for that film, and it was one of the reasons that many of the actors in this film decided that they wanted to sign up with Bernard Rose, because they're like, oh, he's got an artistic eye. That's actually super appealing for me. To quote Bernard Rose about the belief behind Candyman and why he was struck by the story The Forbidden in particular. All of these people believe in the Candyman, which actually means the Candyman exists, whereas if they stop believing in him, he disappears. Like how the old deities, like the Roman gods, died because people stopped caring. The idea that if enough people believe something, they manifest it. That's scary. Bernard Rose was asked about the 2021 Candyman continuation directed by Nia DaCosta, and what he had to say was pretty nice. He said, honestly, I think that sequel is probably better than anything I could have come up with. Okie dokie, let's talk about the ratings, what I kind of feel about this thing. If we're gonna talk about this thriller factor 1 to 10, it's a 3 out of 10. It's not that fast. It's a slow burn. The gore rating, I wrote down 7 out of 10, but I think I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. I changed my mind. There is a lot of blood in this film and a lot of gore. It's not as visceral as what modern CGI can do, but it is still pretty bloody. Storytelling, 7 out of 10. It does have a lot of staying power. I mean, especially about the true aspects of Cabrini Green, this real living, breathing place that had a lot of horrific experiences. I do think it's an original story. I do think it's really cool. I think it's an amazing concept about building belief around a supernatural entity. I think that's a neat concept. The ending scene is not my vibe. So, 7 out of 10. Okay, production value, the cinematography, the music. Oh, you guys, the music in this film is gorgeous, and it really does just make this film. Moreover, when Bernard Rose was talking to Philip Glass about like, well, what kind of music do you sort of see for this film? He gave him kind of a short list of stuff. He said, I'd love to have organ, I'd love to have vocals, and piano. Special effects, 8 out of 10. You guys have to understand, these are real bees for multiple days of shooting that are inside Tony Todd's mouth. The fake blood, a little dated, you can kind of tell. It's the craziest thing. I always feel like fake blood over eras of time in Hollywood, you can kind of tell like, that's 1940s era blood. That's 1960s era blood. Like what Hollywood thinks blood looks like. I do think there are a lot of good things to be learned from the film Candyman. Is it my favorite horror film ever, ever, ever? It's not, but that doesn't mean if it's yours, that's great. The thing about horror that I can appreciate is that there is a wide spectrum of different types of horror that I have grown to appreciate. I like it when a horror film just kind of says a little something, especially if it's through this fictional lens in which we can view the world and view world problems. It's one of my favorite parts about horror is that it is a shared fear that we can project as a society and communicate that in a safe space. That's my belief around horror, and at least that's my romantic thoughts about it. Those are the things that I appreciate most about this film. And moreover, that it became a wonderful beacon for a very specific community to be represented in a genre that frankly kind of ignored them. If you guys remember, I said earlier in this video that who thought to put Philip Glass as the composer for this film? And you know what? I got an answer to that question. And I'm going to talk about it in this video over here. I hope to see you there.